Good afternoon, everybody. This is Eveline Ironcloud, Two Dogs. I am a special programs coordinator with the OJJDP Tribal Youth TTA Center and the Indian Country Child Trauma Center. We are so pleased to bring you the Community of Practice Strategic Planning Toolkit Session 5. Some of you have joined us before. Welcome back. Some of you are new. Welcome. We really appreciate your participation. And we are going to talk about the implementation plan, action planning to implement your project. And I would like to greetings to everybody. Dayan Yahipi, welcome. It is good you are here. That is in the Lakota language. I know that Paulette is trying to teach me how to greet people in Blackfeet. I think it's Oki. I know that where you put the accent on a word makes all the difference. So I apologize if I misspoke that or mispronounced that word. I know Courtney has submitted a greeting, Nawa. I think that's how you say hello in Pawnee. Again, my apologies if I mispronounced. Hinch J. Jerry helped me with that, with the Muskogee Creek greeting. What about your greetings in your language? I don't mean to leave anybody out, but these are the people that have submitted, my colleagues and relatives at the TA Center submitted these greetings for me to use in these webinars. So anybody else, would you like to contribute your greeting in your language? Let's hear from you. And I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce them. I just would like to see, I really love the indigenous languages, and I think that, we were given a gift from the Creator for, in terms of our language. So I just like to offer that opportunity for people to submit their greeting. Okay, Alma Ayuki, hello in Karuk. And again, my apologies if I mispronounced that. Thank you so much, Alma. Chelsea Chukma, I think that's how you say that. Chukma or Chukma. Anin or Buju, hello in Ojibwe. Thank you so much for that, Muriel. And Jala, hello in Athabaskan. The Menominee Nation greeting is pronounced as Po So. Thank you, Ron. Really appreciate that. And Alma said I pronounced the word right. Thank you so much. I got it right the first time. Hawe Dahe. Hello, how are you? Thank you, Ted. What nation are you from? Just type in the chat box. Osage, thank you for that. Jill, Da Na Gok. And what nation is that greeting from, Jill? I really appreciate the contributions you're making. Penobscot. Thank you so much, Jill. Well, we'll move on. We are so fortunate to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Paulette Runningwolf, with us this morning. She is a Technical Assistance Coordinator with the Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center under the Indian Country Child Trauma Center under OJJDP. So I'm going to turn it over to Paulette, Dr. Runningwolf, to give us an opening in a good way. Paulette?
Right. Thank you, Eveline. I appreciate the welcoming. Okay. Mistu Nikana Piku, Kistamaki, Mistu Amskapi Pikanaki, Get 6 Samasten no Wow, Amo Niksu Guwax, Anuksasi Goy, Igi Tom Sisigu, Anaksa Samoska, Io is the Bata Biofig, the Spumakinan, Amo Niksu Guwax, Anuksisi Goy. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you. What I said in Blackfeet in our language, my name is Kistamaki, which means bead woman in English. I am a South Pagan woman and I greeted you as all my relatives, and that today is a good, happy day to come together. I'm praying the Creator will help all of us today. I want to welcome you all for joining this webinar. I know it's difficult with your plates completely full and all of the issues that you're facing in your community. But I would like to also make a note of encouragement that all programs practice opening in a good way by offering a prayer at meetings, at the beginning of activities, whenever you come together. And if the adults would take the lead and take turns practicing saying their prayers, either in your own language or in English, you could even say the Lord's Prayer. One of those, any one of those is really helpful, and it really establishes a way to connect with each other and an understanding that you're coming together. Historically, we've all been impacted by trauma, but I feel the most devastating trauma our communities have experienced was the outlawing of practicing our spiritual beliefs and having to hide it. I'm really pleased to hear many of you know your language in your opening greetings. That's very encouraging. And that whole philosophy of not joining church with state further impacted us. And so it's really important that, an important part of our healing, that we teach our people to pray. We get encouraged, we feel shamed at times because we don't know our language. But the only way you can do that is by starting. And I want to acknowledge Ethelene for pushing me to be able to say our prayer today in Blackfeet, because it's really pushed something that I've been wanting to do a long time. And so I'd like to encourage you to pray together anytime you come together, whether it's for meetings or activities, to start your efforts. And you'll find that, like today, by starting in a good way, everyone's attention is increased, and you'll feel a much more pronounced level of respect for the sacredness of the work you are doing. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Paulette. That was beautiful. I just love to hear indigenous languages because I know it comes from the heart, it comes from the Creator, and we are so blessed to have our indigenous languages still intact. So let's dive in. First of all, we have our OJJDP Tribal Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center staff. Those of you that were here before know that our director is Dr. Dolores Subia Bigfoot. We have our Assistant Director and Director of Evaluation, Dr. Jamie Barkas. Project Manager, our relative Courtney Yarhola from Sac and Fox, and our Project Manager, Janie Braden, and our Project Administrative Assistant, Gandra Lavelle from the Kiowa Tribe. These are our colleagues, our friends, our relatives that are leading this effort. We also have the training assistants, technical training assistants coordinators. Dr. Paulette Runningwolf, you just heard from her in the opening. She's Blackfeet, Anaclo, she's Muskogee Creek, Toja and Natalie Stites from Cheyenne River, Sioux Tribe, myself, and Jerry Weisner from Muskogee Creek. Someone you do not see on there is Erin Thinelk. Toja Erin Thinelk is from the Sicangu Lakota. She recently joined the circle, so welcome, Erin, but she will be her photo and her name will be on there next time. So our agenda is we want to talk about the implementation plan. We want to talk about creating action steps using the SMART approach, and we also want to review an example of an implementation plan. So that's basically what we're going to be doing. So again, welcome. For those of you that just joined, we are talking about implementation plan and action planning. So first of all, we'd like to hear from you about cultural protocol. We know that our people, indigenous people, have always had cultural protocol, cultural openings, like Paulette referred to, cultural closings for anything that we do, any kind of initiative that we do. So what are some of your experiences, ideas, or suggestions related to cultural protocol as part of action planning? Or describe a cultural protocol that you or your community uses when embarking to develop a community project or program. What are some of the things that you do in terms of, okay, now we're going to work with the youth, or we're going to work with the elders, we're going to work with the community. So what is one of the first things that you do as far as cultural protocol, like an action item for beginning something? What's some of your ideas, suggestions, or experiences around that? We'd love to hear from you. So while you're typing, what I would like to do is go into an example. So, for example, in our community, we have a children's healing camp. So one of the things that we do, the first things that we do is we make an offering for the protection of the children, the volunteers, the horses, and everyone that's involved. Anything can happen whenever you're working with children, when you're working with families or youth, so it's really important for our community to make sure that we make an offering. So I have a suggestion or an idea from Natalie. We ask an elder to speak or pray or encourage at the start of meetings. Also, we can ask the elder to choose someone to open the meeting. So that's an excellent example of a cultural protocol that we do that's specific to us, Indigenous communities. And I know that other communities do this also, but for us, Indigenous people, then that is a given, I guess. We also make an offering for good weather. So, for example, this summer we're going to have a lot of activities outside. We know that the grandmothers of the spirit world, the grandfathers of the spirit world, we know that they can bring thunderstorms, they can bring tornadoes, they can bring floods, but they also bring very beautiful days, sunshine, warm, hot, where it's ideal for outdoor activities. So we want to make sure that we have we make an offering so that we do have good weather, we do have good days for these activities so that people will be protected. So Lynette said we have an elder that is on our advisory board, and they take the lead on any cultural component in our program. And that's really, really important because in the Indigenous worldview, then elders are seen as having experience, having wisdom, beyond the younger people. So they are our guides, our mentors. So that's really important. Thank you for that, Lynette. Diane says most meetings and activities of any type are opened with a prayer by an elder of this tribe also. I think that's, again, that's a given. We know that most Indigenous peoples, when they do anything, when they embark on anything, then they have a prayer, they have some type of traditional opening. And that's in line with what we do with the Children's Healing Camp. We make an offering to elders to be a part of the camp because our belief, the Lakota belief, is that when a baby or a child, someone in that first stage of life, like right around 0 to, infant stage to 12 years of age, then right around that age, then if they shake hands with an elder, somebody that's 70, 80, 90 years old, and they're receiving a blessing because that person has, lived through a lot, has endured a lot, and has developed fortitude and courage. So it's a blessing for the child. Maybe they will reach that age. That's the hope and the prayer. So I just wanted to offer this opportunity to discuss cultural protocols in terms of action planning, in terms of implementing, things. A lot of times we get into the business mode of, thinking, okay, we're going to have objectives and we're going to have activities and tasks, but what about the cultural protocol? How do we start with that? How do we integrate it throughout? That's something that Indigenous people have a responsibility to the youth and the community to make sure that, that's integrated throughout. So thank you for that. And how do we integrate community readiness assessment into our implementation plan? The community readiness model is, set up to ensure, it's developed to ensure that the voices of the tribe and community are heard so that they're invested, engaged, and ready to address an issue. I'd just like to acknowledge Ted's input. He says, for something good to start with, invite all participants to a meal, hopefully some traditional foods, such as an open fire, cooked meat and corn. Prayer is given for what we want to happen, and of course, blessing of the food. Make all feel comfortable at this meal. So, Ted, you're making me feel really hungry right now for the open fire, cooked meat and corn. Thank you for that. And I think that's part of the cultural protocol, is that we not only open with a blessing, but we have food at our gatherings. We offer the food as a, not only to our participants, our relatives, but also to the spirit world. Norma says, we have a traditional healer or elder offer an opening and closing blessings. Very, very critical to the any initiative to make sure that all people that have a role in our community have a role in the initiative. So including traditional healers and elders who are part of the community, is very important. So back to the community readiness. This is our, the community readiness model. You've done interviews, you've gathered information, and this can be used to assist your group in the development or revision of your implementation plan. So would anyone like to give an example of how they're using or could use the community readiness model assessment in their action planning? How are you using that? How, like say, for example, you found that you're at a certain stage of readiness to initiate your project, your goals, your objectives. How are you using that in your action planning? So let's hear from you. I've consulted with Barbara Plested and Dr. Pamela Jumper-Thurman about this because I was curious about how to use the community readiness model assessment. And for example, if somebody identified training as one of their activities or one of their strategies to reach their goals and objectives, then they could see where they're at in their readiness to initiate. Maybe they're at the beginning stages, or maybe people already have training, so then they would start further down the line. So any thoughts about that? How are you using or could use the community readiness model assessment in your action planning? Is there any thoughts about that? For those of you that are new, that have just come on, there were community readiness model webinars that were held, and we have those on our YouTube. So in the web links, then there's a YouTube channel link for OJJDP, and you can access those webinars through that. So if you're not familiar with that, then there's some wonderful information, very comprehensive, about the community readiness model and how to use it in your strategic action plan. So if there's no input on that, then we'll move along. But if you do, then I'll go back to that. So our learning objective, defining the purpose of an implementation plan. And I know you all know this. The implementation plan is how you are going to implement your project, your activities. So Alma has a contribution. We use this community readiness assessment to develop an action plan to create youth resource cards that have immediate resources and numbers for youth in crisis. And that is so wonderful, because from the community readiness model work, then Alma's community has seeing that this is what they need. They need resource information for their youth, and particularly for youth in crisis. So that's very important in terms of how you use the Community Readiness Assessment, Community Readiness Model Assessment. So thank you for that, Alma. So our implementation plan, the purpose of it is to outline how the goals and objectives of your project will be carried out. Very critical. I've been involved in a lot of different, activities and initiatives, and there's 1,000 details. For example, we have our healing camps for our children age 0 to 11. We have another healing camp for our boys, young men, age 11 to 17, and we also have a healing camp for girls, age 11 to 17. And there's 1,000 details that need to be worked out. Something that we didn't think of, it will come up. Those of you that have ever been to a Sundance ceremony, there's a lot of details involved in that too, in the planning and carrying it out. And when they go get the sacred tree for the Sundance, then they need an axe to chop the tree. And one year, and my husband, who is a leader he's called a Sundance chief, he gathered all the men, and they were getting ready to go get the tree, and he said, who has the axe? And so every year there's a new axe that has to be purchased, and they wrap it with sage, and they pray with it, and they bless it, and then that's used to chop the tree. And nobody had an axe. And everybody looked at my brother-in-law, his younger brother, as if it was his responsibility to get the axe, but he wasn't told that that was his responsibility. So things like that happen. We overlook something that, might seem minor at the time, but then we realize this is a very critical element or tool or step that we need. So anyway, that's part of, planning, is that we need to allow for, consider all of the details. So I would just like to acknowledge, too, as I go on, your contributions, and lack of trust in leadership was an issue that came up in our community readiness. So in our outreach for our program, we're doing as much face-to-face communication as we can. It seems to be much more effective than just mailings and phone calls. A personal touch sends the message that you are important. So what Anne has found in their community readiness model work is that it's much more effective to do face-to-face work in terms of communication, and it seems to be more effective for them than just relying on mail-outs or phone calls or emails. So thank you for that. So that's our purpose of an implementation plan. Outline how the goals and objectives of your project will be carried out. So the learning objective 2 is to create action steps to accomplish objectives using the SMART acronym approach, the SMART approach. So what are the SMART objectives? They're specific. They're concrete, detailed, well-defined. You know where you're going and what to expect when you arrive. They're measurable. The numbers and quantities provide means of measurement and comparison. They're achievable. They're feasible, easy to put into action. They're realistic. The objective considers constraints such as resources, personnel, cost, and time frame. Time-bound. A time frame helps to set boundaries around the objective. So we might say, we want to do this within a certain time period, maybe within the next year. This is what we're going to accomplish. Those are our SMART objectives. So give an example of a SMART objective that you have come up with, that you're using, or it could be just a fictitious example of a SMART objective. Again, what are those? What is a SMART objective? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Okay, so let's take this week. By the end of this week, what are you going to accomplish specifically? How will you know you've accomplished it? How do you measure it? Is it achievable? Is it realistic? Is it time-bound? So one example is, for example, I try to walk every day, but sometimes that gets to be like I prioritize something else when I shouldn't do that. I should just, go and walk no matter what. But in my mind, then I think, oh, I'll do that tomorrow. So if I was to set a goal of walking 5 days a week or maybe 7 days a week for 1 hour every day, then that's not realistic for me, and it's not achievable. It is measurable, it is specific, and it is time-bound, but consider that things come up, whether maybe my own mood about walking. So something more realistic might be walking for 1 hour 4 times a week, something like that. So that's a very simplistic example. Do you have other examples about what is a SMART objective that you can come up with? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So in your project, in your grant, then what did you say you would do? And translate that into a specific, a measurable, an achievable, a realistic, time-bound objective. So this takes some thinking about as far as, well, how do we, craft our objectives so that they are SMART, they are specific, they are measurable, they are achievable, realistic, and time-bound. What do you think? I know people are typing, so we'll go forward, and as people give their input, then we will come back to them. So our learning objective 3 is to review an implementation plan template as an example of a tool, both linear and holistic. So we'll go forward with that. And this is kind of hard to see. I apologize for that. We're trying to get all the information on the page without losing anything. So if you need to make your screen bigger, do you see those little arrows on top? Then you can do that. You can make it into full screen, and you won't see the participant chat or anything like that. You'll just see the chart. But what this example is reducing crime and violence by 20% in a housing cluster or community using a culturally specific approach by the end of year 1. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this objective as SMART as possible. So we have what we're going to do. It's specific. We're going to reduce crime and violence. It doesn't say how we're going to do it, but it says that's what we're going to do. It's measurable by 20%. But 20% from what? What is the rate now? We have to consider that. And where are we going to do this? In a housing cluster and community. How are we going to do it? A culturally specific approach. That's realistic. We also it's time-oriented. So by the end of year 1, we should be able to do this if we plan accordingly. So look at the anticipated outcome. What will ultimately happen after the SMART objective is implemented? We hope that children residing in the housing cluster will have less exposure and experiences of violence and will feel safer in their community. That's our focus. So that's the anticipated outcome. So if we were to implement this, what are the specific action steps? So I want to go to Norma's contribution for her SMART objective. Now that school has ended for most youth, I will make one weekly out-of-school contact via phone with each drug court participant. Okay, that is specific. She's going to make contact with youth. It's measurable. How will she know that she has done this? I'm sure that she'll have a log and a date, so that's measurable. One weekly. It's time-oriented. It's realistic via phone. I'm sure, Norma, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure phoning would be much more achievable than actually going out and trying to find the youth. So she's making sure that it's reasonable, realistic, I should say. So Anne is you hearing a lot of background noise, a lot of static? I am. I apologize for that. I don't know if it's my phone. Okay, so Anne said she will hold 3 workshops at the Tribal Plank House over the course of the next 3 months with at least 25 youth attending. That is specific, 3 workshops. And I would suggest, if you could, to what kind of workshops? What's the focus? What's the topic? So if you could revise that to hold 3 workshops focusing on or with the topics of at the Tribal Plank House, that's specific, over the course of the next 3 months, realistic, with at least 25 youth attending. So that's measurable. Time-oriented is the next 3 months. So the 25 youth attending, and what I would suggest is, say, with at least 25 youth attending per workshop, or is it over the 3 workshops? See, that's how you make it very more specific, I guess. So, Mark, I lost my connectivity on my internet, and I don't know what's happened. I apologize for the tech issue here, but we will just go forward. I do have a copy of the slides, so we'll go forward with that. So going back to the chart, look at the specific action steps. How are we going to reduce crime and violence by 20% in a housing cluster community using a culturally specific approach by the end of year 1? We hope our anticipated outcome is that children residing in the housing cluster will have less exposure to and experiences of violence and will feel safer in their community. The specific action steps, these are just examples, and I know that you would have input on this in terms of, maybe you would do something a little differently. Maybe you might do it in, different order. So ask yourself, what are the steps needed to accomplish your SMART objective? So the task should be completed in sequence so that some tasks we know we need to go 1, 2, 3. Sometimes some tasks we need to go back and make sure that we are covered, we've covered all the steps. So for example, one of the action steps would be create process for the ongoing community input partnership. However, what you've, the wonderful contributions that you made in terms of cultural protocol, be a first step. So have an elder come and bless your initiative, give an opening, have a meal, have a, some type of cultural protocol, some type of cultural opening that is consistent with your community's culture, with your tribal nation's culture. So the next step might be to create process for an ongoing community input partnership. Those of you that have been doing this work for community work for a long time, you know that it's very difficult to come in, try to make change from the outside going in. That change is always more transformational, more effective when it's from the community itself. So that's why that community input and partnership is very, very important. But what is the timeline? We would begin this by month 2 because we just don't go out and say, okay, we're going to develop community partnerships. So we need to have an action plan for that, right? Who are we going to contact? Why is this partner important? So who's responsible for this? So the project coordinator in partnership with the community leaders would be responsible. This action step of creating a process for ongoing community input and partnership is really critical to making sure that we understand the potential barriers and the strengths. What can we use? What are our strengths that we can use to overcome the potential barriers? So the barriers might be community mistrust, and I think somebody had mentioned that about mistrusting the leadership in the community. We might have a sentiment from the community saying, oh no, another program that's going to tell us what to do and how to live. I've encountered that before where people are just very, they don't trust. They've been through programs and initiatives before, and they just do not want to deal with another program. So what are the strengths that we can use to overcome such a barrier? The natural community leaders, the natural community supports. So a natural community support might be the cultural aspect, so providing a meal and inviting people to that community and just visiting with them and not jumping right into paperwork or not jumping right into these are our objectives, but just visiting with people. That's one of our strengths that we have in the community. So we have natural community leaders that are not elected, that are not, part of anything, but people look to them and go to them for support and strength. So we could partner with them to create this process for an ongoing community input partnership. So what are some of the action steps under creating process for ongoing community input and partnership? For example, make an offering for the initiative. And I think if that was done, in a community, that would be appreciated in terms of being respectful of the culture. Identify and approach the natural leaders of the community. Identify and develop cultural protocols for approaching the community. We plan for the initial gathering of the community of the housing cluster. So what are we going to do there? What's our agenda? What resources do we need? Materials, supplies. What time of day should we have it? What day should we have it? Plan for a healthy meal. Offer tobacco and a gift to elders in the community to give the opening blessing and words of encouragement. Be inclusive. Everybody is welcome. So our timeline to do all this is begin month 2 through month 6. By the time month 6 comes, we should have our planning notes, should have a sheet for planning meetings. We should have community gathering planning notes with outcomes, next steps, who's responsible. So here's a wonderful thing about working with the community, that things come out of there, they're developed that we don't expect. So a potential byproduct is a written protocol for community partnership when that has never been documented. So for example, one of the our people have experienced a lot of trauma. So what is the protocol for around culture and around cultural responsiveness to trauma? How do we implement that? There's a lot of resources out there, and some of those resources are not, they're not as visible as, like say, something published or a program online. It might be our elders, our traditional healers that we can go to for what is the protocol for responding to trauma in a culturally respectful way. So that might be a byproduct. So this is more of a linear type of process of developing SMART objectives, of doing action planning, of doing an implementation plan. And I'm really, really sorry that I cannot see the chat room, and I cannot get on the internet. I'm just going by my slides. So Mark or Natalie, if there's anything in the chat room that you could make sure that we acknowledge, can you do that now? Hello?
Hi, this is Natalie. Can you hear me?
I hear you. Thank you, Toja. Is there anything in the chat room that we need to acknowledge?
Yes. Ann Niblett stated her amendment to her statement and said utilizing healing of the canoe curriculum in regards to the workshops, what they would be. Ted Moore says, I'm new to the webinar training, but would like to add this. The way that could occur is to have cedar ceremony at the start of the at the start of the project, meaning to pray for good things for our youth participants and successes for them. Even mention the families and community in prayer. Then cedar off the youth and counselors. This is burning of cedar and fanning or blessing the youth individually. A respected elder could do this. He could pick a youth to help him to do this. And that is the contributions from the chat box.
Thank you so much, Toja. Those are all very critical, steps in terms of, like the cultural protocol and developing the objectives is to making sure that we're consistent with, the community's culture. So I would like to open it up to any questions. Type your questions in the chat box or your comments, and as we go along, then I can ask Toja, Natalie to read those questions or comments, and then we'll respond to them to the best of our ability. So this, again, this is a linear type of process of developing a SMART objective. We want to reduce crime and violence by 20% in a housing cluster and community using a culturally specific approach by the end of year 1. These specific action steps speaks to just one step in that whole process. So in order for children residing in that housing cluster to have less exposure and experiences of violence and to feel safer in their community, then one of the steps we're going to start with is to create a process for ongoing community input and partnership, because we want to make sure that we're with the community, we're all on the same page, they know what's going on, they give input, they guide the process, and how will we know that it's going to happen? We're going to have our planning notes, we're going to have a sign-in sheet, we're going to have outcomes, next steps, who's responsible, and out of this, then we might have a written protocol for community partnership for that specific community. That would be so valuable for other projects or other initiatives that come in. They'll have a template or a plan for that cultural protocol. So that is something we wanted to share with you. Are there any questions, Toja, Natalie, that you see in the chat box? Any questions or comments?
Hi. Someone is typing in the box, but no questions so far.
All right, we'll go on to the next slide. So here's an example of a holistic planning tool, and this is from my community. And in fact, my husband, you'll see at the bottom, our 2 dogs developed this for one of his, part of his work. And I asked his permission to use it. And what it is, it's a Lakota culturally based action planning tool to assist in healing from trauma. So it's in our language, and again, you know, the text is real small. We tried to get everything on the slide. However, if you can't see it, then you can expand your screen so that you can see better. And all of these slides are going to, since this is recorded, then these slides will be available to you too. So, so if you look at the top, the Wakipka, Yekya, recognizing the trauma, recognizing that something needs to be addressed. So in our way, in the Lakota way, then we might do a spiritual assessment. But however, people might just that they need, of intervention for some trauma that they've experienced. It was witnessing a car accident, was losing a relative to traumatic death, like maybe in a car accident or something. Maybe it was personal trauma that was experienced in childhood or even in adulthood, but we recognize that. We recognize the trauma has an impact on our spirit, on our mind, on our body, our emotions, on our lives, our families. So what we start with is Wopakinte, which is a spiritual cleansing, spiritual purification, because in our belief, we believe that trauma leaves a residue, some type of spiritual residue that is felt but not seen. People report feeling like something's on them, they can't get clean, they shower all the time, or they feel like burdened, or they feel heavy, like something's on them. So this Wopakinte is done through a ceremony where they're purified spiritually from the residue of that trauma. And if the trauma was really severe, then they would go to the next step, which is the Nagi Kichopi, calling back the spirit. Because in our belief system, the spirit can leave the body if the trauma is very, very severe, very sudden, as a self-protective action. So there's a ceremony to reintegrate the spirit with the mind and the body. And because trauma impacts our spirit, depending on the severity, then we may need what's called a woapia, the doctoring for the trauma. So for example, when you cut yourself, you have an injury, you break a bone, then you go to the hospital, you go to your healthcare provider. They might set the bone, they might give you medicine, to make sure that, you heal properly. It's the same way with the spirit. The spirit needs medicine also. So the doctoring is for the spirit, and it's for specifically for the trauma, So, and then the next step after that is the Wopila, the Thanksgiving ceremony. Anytime we receive anything, then we give back. We give thanks as part of ceremony. So that's something that is a process, I guess, of action planning where we use what we use for responding to trauma in a culturally specific way. So it's just an example. What are some of your examples of holistic cultural planning tools? We started with a cultural protocol where you advised, you gave input about, how that's done, calling on an elder, calling on a traditional healer to open the meeting, to bless your initiative, providing a meal. So those are, I guess, basically cultural protocol aspects of planning. But what is a tool that you use? Like, what is a holistic planning tool that you can use to integrate into your initiative, into your project? So, Toja, Natalie, I'm going to call on you again to see if we have anything in the chat box or any kind of comments that you want to make. And I know
Hello.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chewy. I would like to acknowledge a comment in the chat box, and it is from our colleague Anna Rangel. I think when you set forth these goals and you outline them in a way that you can share with your stakeholders and community, it helps everyone to get behind your plan. And in support of that, and to relate it to the slide before us, I think it's important that you reinterpret your goals and objectives in a way that is based and rooted with your culture and community. And that helps to mobilize to take the action needed to fulfill your plan.
I agree. So whenever we submit our grant narratives, our applications for funding, then it's in a certain format, right? It's, strategy, objective, task, timeline, and it's very important to, like Toja and Natalie said, to make sure that it's consistent with the culture. So, and I appreciate your input. And I'm back online now. I have internet again, so internet access. So thank you, Toja and Natalie, for doing that. So, Anna, when you set forth goals and you outline them in a way that you can share with your stakeholders and community, it helps everyone to get behind your plan. So, Anna, would you agree that making sure that the language is not in grant speak and not in program terminology, that it's language that the community is comfortable with and that our stakeholders understand? So if we were to put a very technical goal objective out there, then people their eyes would glaze over and they might, say, oh, another program. But if we put it in language, like, for example, our children, using that example before, where our children are experiencing violence, our children are being exposed to violence, how are we going to eliminate that? And ask the community, how can we make children feel safer in their communities? And I think that might engage people more than, oh, we're going to reduce crime and violence by 20% in a housing cluster or community, using a culturally specific approach by the end of year one. That's more of grant speak, I guess. So putting the outcome, what we hope to achieve in plain language, making sure that it engages the community, I think that's really critical. So are there any other comments, questions about what you've heard so far? Again, you all have holistic planning tools that may have never been put down on paper, but they were very effective. So, for example, thousands of years ago, how did we all survive to come to this point, 2016? We were very strategic, right? We were very smart. We were specific. We had measurable, outcomes. We had timelines, so there's, I think, probably thousands of examples out there of holistic planning tools that we can call on to help us in our planning. So far, what do you all think? Is this helpful? Is this triggering some thoughts in your mind? What are you thinking? Okay, so Lynette talks about difficulty in getting someone to back the program because of a different way of belief and not believing in the traditional ways. That's certainly a dilemma, an issue that I think all of us face in our communities, where somebody might not be on the same page in terms of, well, we want to do something culturally, but it's inconsistent with somebody's beliefs, with somebody's way of doing things or how they were brought up, So, I think what's important is that, okay, what is the outcome? How are we going to achieve this? What can that person contribute? So again, using that example of children, reducing or eliminating children being exposed to violence or having experiences of violence, children feeling safer in their community, what can people that don't really ascribe to how we're doing things, what can they contribute? They still have the strengths, they still have, skills and talents that they can bring to the circle to achieve this. So asking them, okay, well, you don't, really believe in how we're doing this, like in our traditional ways, our cultural ways. What is it that you can contribute to make this happen for our children? Because the focus is our children, right? Not our own beliefs, not our own, personal opinions or beliefs. It's the children feeling safer in their communities, and I'm just using that as an example. So another contribution from Lynette is somebody being invited to, but they don't attend. I think, that's always going to happen. There's going to be people out there that are going to be the naysayers. That isn't going to work. I don't want to participate with them. One thing that we need to acknowledge in our communities is the feuds that go on. There's political feuds, there's personal feuds, there's family feuds, and that impacts the planning, it impacts the implementation, so we really need to be acknowledged. We need to acknowledge that. We need to be smart about that. That's realistic, right? That happens in every community. So Ted is commenting, very helpful. He agrees that our Native culture needs to be integrated with the activities throughout the year. In the Kaw Nation's case, it's necessary to focus on family and community and taking care of each other. And I think that's really you really focused in on something critical, Ted. Whenever we actually implement things, we are taking care of each other. Whenever we say we want our children to be safe in our communities, then what we're focusing on is our future, because the children are the future. They will be the ones that have the leadership. They will be the ones that will take roles and responsibilities in adulthood that will lead us. So it's very important to take care of them now. Any other comments or questions? Any contributions that you have? I know that all of you have a lot of experience and wisdom, the communities that you've come from, that you've been through a lot. And once again, I lost internet connectivity, Toja, Natalie, and Mark, so I'm going to be calling on you. So what we would like to do is just review and offer time for questions and wrap up. So you've heard a lot of information about planning, about implementation plan, about cultural protocols. An example, the purpose of an implementation plan is to outline how goals and objectives will be carried out. The Community Readiness Model Assessment information can be integrated into the process. And you've done that work where you've gone out, you've done interviews, you look at your scores, you look at your input from the community, and that informs the whole planning process, the action planning, the implementation plan. The action steps are used to accomplish objectives using the SMART approach. We talked a lot about the SMART approach, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-oriented. And there are various types of implementation plan models. What we've offered here, the examples we've shown are just examples. You have your own. You have experience with, or of models that would be more effective for you. So don't be afraid to share those with us. As far as I've used this implementation plan model or this action planning model, and this was effective for our community, and certainly we can learn from that. So if you have any examples like that, don't be afraid to type it into the chat box. So Ted, I'm just looking at the chat box here. I'm back online. I have the internet access again, and I really apologize for the technology issues that I'm having with the internet access. I know that it's not conducive to learning when somebody keeps losing their internet access and has to interrupt the flow. So Ted is talking about, I think many of our tribes have a common core of helping each other, our elders and children. In old ways, we all had a role of responsibility. Isn't that so true? Everybody has a role and responsibility to keep children safe. So, and I'm just using that as an example. Everyone has a role and responsibility to make sure that children are happy and to make sure that our communities are safe and healthy. So I agree. We all have that role and responsibility, that nobody is left out, that we're inclusive, and we want to make sure that we do have that integrated throughout our planning process. Any other comments or questions, input? Well, take a stretch, take a deep breath. I know you've been sitting for a while. You've been sitting probably for over an hour now, so wiggle your toes, reach out to the sky, roll your shoulders, take a deep breath. We're almost done here. If there's no questions or comments, what are our next steps? The implementation plan, as you know, is due June 30th, 2016. That's just, what is today, the 24th, about 5 weeks out, a little less than 5 weeks out. We're going to meet again through the webinar on June 28th, and we're going to talk about developing logic models. So again, I know that all of you have this information, you have the skills to do this. Our role is to offer opportunities and offer some time to really look at examples of logic models. And I would like to acknowledge Anna. Like the plan that was presented, noting barriers and outlining ways to overcome the barriers is very important. Setting forth the goals and objectives with the resources and the possible barriers will help you with a realistic timeline on meeting your objective. I think that's very an important insight, because a lot of times we set plans and we say, oh, this is what we're going to do, and then we don't really delve into the barriers that are out there. What can come up? So for example, in the Lakota worldview, then we have our 7 values, 7 laws. One of them is Wa'unshila, which means compassion. So what does that mean exactly? How do you implement compassion? How do you operationalize compassion? There's a lot of ways to do it. So for example, one way that we have that we teach our children and our grandchildren, when somebody comes to your home, you welcome them, you give them, you offer them food, you offer them something to drink, and That's the compassion. So what is the threat, to the values being not implemented, to the values being not prioritized? We have to identify those threats too to the well-being of our people. So I really agree with that the barriers really have to be looked at. Not in terms of, oh, we've already tried that, or, that's not going to work, and throwing it out the window, but really looking at, a strategy, an objective, a plan with a realistic eye in terms of, okay, well, this could be a barrier. How are we going to address that? So thank you, Anna, for that. So again, we're going to be talking about logic models on June 28th, so please join us. We are also going to, you are also going to be submitting your implementation plan on June 30th, and if you have any questions about that, consult with your technical assistance coordinators, and they will certainly have information for you on that if you do have questions. Well, we'd like to thank you. We usually schedule 90 minutes for a webinar like this, but if there's no questions, no input, then we are not averse to ending early and giving you more time to focus on, whatever you need to focus on. So thank you for your presence, your spirit, your good works. We look forward to, having a long, harmonious relationship with you all. Here's our contact information. If you have any questions, call the Indian Country Child Trauma Center. The phone number is 405-271-8858. Our email is icctc@ouhc.edu. The community of practice dial-in information, what you call in today, will always stay the same. So this is the information here. And we also have a survey, a link to our survey, so please respond to that. And I would like to now turn it over to my Trojan. In Lakota, Trojan means niece, and even if we aren't related by blood, then one of our protocols is to address each other, by kinship terms. So I would like to really extend my appreciation to Toja Natalie for being here on the phone and being on the webinar to be my backup as far as, the technology issues. I really appreciate that. Also to Mark and Chelsea, to Gandra, to Paulette, to everybody that contributed to this webinar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Toja Natalie. Any comments that you might have, any closing that you'd like to offer?
Thank you, Tui Asleen. I would like to say that I'm very humbled professionally and personally to have this opportunity to learn from everyone on this webinar. And I want to offer a closing for this window in time that we got to spend together and learn from each other. Please come to the aid of the youth that we all work on behalf of.
Thank you so much. And remember, everybody, to click on the link for the survey, for the evaluation. We'd really appreciate hearing from you how this went for you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.